Japan today is famous for its trains, lightning fast, precisely on time, and seamlessly connected. From the bullet trains of the Shinkansen to the punctual subways of Tokyo, it's a country where motion feels effortless. But it wasn't always like this. Before the age of engines and asphalt, Japan was a land of footpaths and ferry boats, horses and hand-carried chairs. Getting from one place to another was slow, physical, and often uncertain. If you were a merchant in the city of Kyoto in the year 1500, or a monk walking to a mountain shrine in the year 1180, you had no trains, no buses, and no cars. Your journey would begin on foot, and only if you had permission. Because travel in ancient Japan wasn't just about distance. It was shaped by terrain, class, danger, and ritual. The mountains blocked roads, the rivers had no bridges, and samurai patrols controlled who passed through checkpoints. Still, people moved. Pilgrims walked hundreds of kilometers to sacred sites. Samurai rode through dangerous provinces to reach their lords. Couriers sprinted between castles with messages tied to their belts. There were no engines, but there was a system. One built on human endurance, sacred geography, and deeply held traditions. In this episode of Japan Rewind, we'll explore how people got around in Japan before trains and cars. We'll walk the roads of the Edo period. We'll ride in the palanquins of the elite. We'll drift down rivers with merchants, and we'll sleep in wooden inns along the roadside, where strangers gathered by candlelight. Because if you want to understand ancient Japan, you have to understand how it moved. Every path tells a story. Every journey held meaning. This is the story of walking, riding, rowing, and carrying. This is how people got around in ancient Japan, when the only engines were muscle, wind, and will, the geography of movement. Before you can understand how people traveled in ancient Japan, you have to understand what they were up against. Japan is a mountainous country. Nearly 3/4 of its land is covered by forests and steep terrain. Rugged coastlines and volcanic ridges cut through the archipelago, leaving narrow flatlands and winding paths between natural barriers. In the west, the Japanese Alps create snow-covered obstacles in winter. In the east, fog drifts over swampy lowlands. And all across the country, rivers twist unpredictably, fed by rainfall and mountain springs. Unlike places like Rome or China, which built vast networks of roads across plains, ancient Japan had to work around nature. There was no single grid of movement. Instead, there were footpaths carved through valleys, wooden bridges thrown across rivers, and small trails hugging the edges of rice terraces and forests. Some regions became nearly isolated for months in winter. Others were only reachable by boat, especially in parts of Kyushu, Shikoku, and the far north of Honshu. This geography shaped the very structure of Japanese society. Villages grew close-knit and inward. Dialect, culture, and customs became hyper-local, because travel between places was so difficult. The capital, whether it was Heian-kyo, Kyoto, during the Heian period, or Edo, modern Tokyo, later on, was often cut off from far provinces for weeks at a time. Even so, movement did happen. Pilgrims found sacred paths, merchants followed seasonal trade routes, and warriors rode through treacherous mountain passes. The terrain also affected the types of transport people used. Where flat roads were rare, horses struggled. Where rivers flooded, bridges washed away. Where snow fell heavy, people walked in straw boots and wrapped their legs in cloth. Geography wasn't just the backdrop to movement. It was the first force that defined it. If you were traveling across Japan in the year 1200, your journey wouldn't begin with a map. It would begin with a prayer to the land itself. Because every step was shaped by stone, rain, wind, and river. And in that way, Japan's geography didn't just influence travel, It created a culture of resilience, patience, and ritual around the very act of moving. The walking nation. In ancient Japan, the most common way to travel was simple, on foot. From samurai to farmers, if you needed to go somewhere, you walked. Horses were rare and reserved for the elite. Carts were almost useless on the steep, winding trails that laced the country. And roads were more like beaten paths, muddy in the rain, snow-covered in winter. Walking wasn't just transportation, it was a national reality. Monks journeyed between temples by foot. Pilgrims walked to shrines like Jingu or Kumano Hongu. Even government messengers ran long distances barefoot, delivering scrolls across provinces. People wore straw sandals called waraji, made from twisted rice stalks. They carried kongozue, walking staffs often blessed at temples. Clothing was simple, layered for weather, and wrapped tight for long days on the road. And distance? It wasn't measured in kilometers. Ancient Japan used a unit called the rai, roughly 4 kilometers. For clarity, we'll use both. When we say 6 rai, we'll also say about 24 kilometers. That way, you can walk with us, in both worlds. A strong traveler might cover 6 to 8 rai per day. That's 24 to 32 kilometers, depending on terrain, age, and season. The most famous walking route, the Tokaido, stretched between Kyoto and Edo, modern-day Tokyo. It covered over 130 ri, or more than 500 kilometers. Some travelers completed it in under 3 weeks, stopping each night at roadside post towns. Walking was built into the culture. Villages were laid out along routes. Tea houses opened beside paths. Shrines marked milestones for weary travelers. And the walking journey wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Buddhists believed that movement itself could burn away karma. Pilgrimage became penance, and the body's effort was part of the offering. In this way, Japan didn't just walk for need, it walked for meaning. So when we say ancient Japan was a walking nation, we're saying more than just people had no cars. We're saying walking was woven into the identity of the land, horses, and the elite. While most people in ancient Japan traveled on foot, a select few, mainly the elite warrior class, had access to something rare and powerful: the horse. Horses first arrived in Japan from the Korean peninsula during the Kofun period, around the 4th or 5th century, brought by migrants who also introduced metal tools and rice farming. But they didn't become widely used until much later, particularly in the Kamakura and Muromachi periods, when samurai rose to prominence. Unlike in Europe or China, horses in Japan were not used for heavy transport or farming. They were primarily reserved for military use and high-status travel. Owning a horse was a symbol of rank, something reserved for samurai, nobles, or imperial envoys. Riding itself wasn't easy. Japan's landscape, full of steep hills, rocky paths, and narrow trails, made mounted travel a challenge. Horses had to be smaller and more agile, and riders had to be skilled in maneuvering them through tight passes and muddy roads. Still, for those who could afford it, riding offered advantages. It meant speed, prestige, and status. When a samurai rode into town, people took notice. Traveling, mounted signaled authority, and sometimes danger. The horses themselves were decorated, especially during ceremonial occasions. During the Edo period, daimyo lords were required to travel to and from the capital of Edo every few years, under the system of sankin kotai, alternate attendants. They often did so on horseback, accompanied by hundreds of retainers, banners, and baggage trains. These journeys became public spectacles, designed to show power and allegiance to the shogun. But not all samurai rode all the time. Horses were reserved for certain legs of the journey. Even elite travelers would often walk alongside their horses when terrain was difficult. And riding wasn't without restriction. Under Tokugawa law, commoners were forbidden to own or ride horses without permission. It was a privilege, and a reminder of your place in the social order. So while most of Japan moved step by step, the mounted elite lived in a different rhythm. Their hooves echoed authority. Their saddles carried not just bodies, but titles, messages, and command. And when they passed by, you'd know. Someone important was moving through the land. Palanquins and human-powered transport. If horses were a symbol of power, then palanquins were a symbol of refined status and privilege without effort. Known in Japanese as keigo and norimono, these were human-carried transport boxes, like small cabins or chairs, suspended between long poles, hoisted on the shoulders of 2 or more men. They were used by the nobility, wealthy merchants, and especially upper-class women who were forbidden from riding horses publicly during much of the Edo period. The palanquin offered privacy, protection from weather, and a way to maintain social decorum. Inside, a traveler could recline, read, nap, or simply gaze out through the bamboo slats. It was a world within a world, drifting past rice fields, mountain passes, and temple gates, while one remained untouched by dust or sweat. The size and decoration of a palanquin said a lot about the person inside. The norimono used by daimyo lords on formal visits to Edo were elaborate. Lacquered wood, silk cushions, gold leaf trim. They were flanked by guards and retainers and moved in slow, choreographed procession. But the more common kago was simpler, a narrow, basket-like seat carried by 2 bearers. You'd see them in the streets of Kyoto, weaving between crowds or waiting outside tea houses to carry a customer home. And while it might sound like luxury for the men carrying them, it was anything but. Keigo bearers were incredibly fit. They had to support heavy loads for hours, navigating uneven roads, stairs, and rain. Their work was exhausting, poorly paid, and often dangerous. Yet their labor made elite movement possible. This human-powered travel system was so embedded in society that entire guilds of bearers existed. In larger towns, you could hire a keigo, like a modern taxi, pay by distance or time. In mountainous areas where horses couldn't pass, keigo were the only practical transport, even for government officials. And for women of the upper class, especially those who rarely walked in public, the palanquin wasn't just comfort. It was a moving veil of respectability. So while one part of Japan walked with sandals in the mud, another part drifted above it all, suspended between 2 shoulders, with hardly a sound, the world tilting and swaying just outside the slats of a bamboo screen. The Hikyaku courier system. In a world without email, phones, or even railways, how did news travel? How did lords send commands? How did a merchant in Kyoto learn of a shipment in Osaka? The answer, Hikyaku, Japan's ancient courier runners. From as early as the Heian period, and especially during the Edo era, these messengers formed the backbone of long-distance communication. They were lean, relentless, and trusted, and they moved faster than anyone else in the country. The word hikyaku literally means flying legs. And that's exactly what they were. These couriers weren't just runners, they were specialists. Trained to move quickly and efficiently across vast distances, they carried letters, scrolls, and even small parcels in sealed wooden containers strapped to their backs. Each hikyaku had a fixed route. Like a relay system, they passed messages from one runner to the next at designated stations, sometimes called shukuba, spaced out every 4 to 6 ri, that's 16 to 24 kilometers. These men didn't walk, they ran, for hours, every day, through rain, wind, and snow. In the Edo period, the courier networks were formalized under the Tokugawa shogunate. There were official hikyaku systems for government use, merchant guild couriers for trade, and even temple messengers. Messages between Edo and Kyoto, a journey of over 130 ri, or 500 kilometers, could be delivered in just 3 to 4 days using relay runners. And they didn't just deliver mail, they were the pulse of the country, carrying news of war, famine, birth, death, and political change. Hikyaku wore minimal gear, a fundoshi-style wrap for ease of movement, a small cap, and protective sandals reinforced with leather or bark. Some tied bells to their waists to warn people to clear the path. Others carried paper lanterns at night, running like flickers of news across the dark landscape. The most trusted hikyaku were even allowed to carry secrets, messages encoded with poetry or clan symbols known only to the recipient. For most Japanese, movement meant walking slowly, but for the hikyaku, it meant speed, secrecy, and service. And when they ran by, dust flying, bells jingling, villagers would stop and watch in silence, because they knew history was in motion. Roads, stations, and the Tokaido. By the early 1700s, Japan had built something remarkable, a national system of roads, complete with stations, checkpoints, and travel regulations, all without a single engine. At the heart of this system was the Tokaido, the Eastern Sea Route. Stretching from Edo, the seat of the shogun, to Kyoto, the imperial capital, it covered over 130 ri, or about 500 kilometers. This was not just a path. It was a lifeline that connected power, commerce, and culture. The Tokaido was one of the Gokaido, or 5 routes, official highways established by the Tokugawa shogunate during the early 1700s. These roads were meant to consolidate control, improve communication, and regulate travel across the land. Along these routes were shukuba, official post towns spaced about every 4 to 6 ri, or 16 to 24 kilometers. These were more than just rest stops. They were small cities in their own right, offering inns, food, stables, couriers, and entertainment. For travelers, these towns were a welcome sight, a place to eat hot rice, drink sake, soak sore feet, and hear the local gossip. But there were also checkpoints, called sekisho, where travelers had to present papers, answer questions, and sometimes undergo inspections. These were not optional. They were part of the shogunate's system of control, especially to enforce the policy known as sankin kotai, or alternate attendance, which required daimyo lords to regularly travel to and from Edo with their entire retinues. Even the width of the roads was regulated. Main routes were kept wide enough for 2 palanquins to pass, a standard of infrastructure remarkable for a pre-industrial nation. And travel permits? They mattered. Commoners couldn't just wander the country. You needed authorization, whether as a merchant, pilgrim, or performer. Maps of these roads were made and sold. Guidebooks listed inns, scenic spots, and dangers. Artists like Hiroshige created famous woodblock prints of the 53 stations of the Tokaido, capturing the essence of travel in a single image. These weren't just roads, they were arteries of movement, culture, and memory. To walk the Tokaido was to trace the lines of a country's beating heart, one step, one inn, one checkpoint at a time. Rivers, ferries, and sea routes. While most roads in ancient Japan cut through valleys and hills, some journeys followed water. Japan is a land of islands, mountains, and rivers, and in many places, water was the only way to travel. If you were headed to a distant province, a sacred island, or a port town across the bay, you didn't ride or walk, you sailed. Rivers like the Sumida, Kiso, and Yodo served as key arteries, and though bridges were rare, especially in the early periods, ferries were everywhere. These ferries, or watashibune, were small wooden boats rowed or poled across the water by locals who knew the current's moods. There were no motors, only muscle, tide, and rhythm. Travelers paid a small fee to cross, sometimes waiting for hours during storms or high waters. In flood season, rivers swelled so high that ferries were canceled for days, stranding entire caravans on muddy banks. And yet, the rivers remained essential. In urban areas like Edo, boats served as taxis. People commuted by canal, gliding beneath bridges, past warehouses and tea houses. In the countryside, merchant boats brought rice, cloth, and sake downstream to castle towns. Pilgrims rode ferries to sacred destinations like Itsukushima Shrine, whose torii gate floats on the sea. And when the journey demanded a longer haul, travelers took to the open water. Japan's coastline, jagged and abundant with inlets, made coastal navigation both dangerous and vital. Boats hugged the shore, stopping at harbors like Nagoya, Osaka, and Hakata. Many of these routes were seasonal, timed to avoid typhoons or winter winds. Ships varied by region. Some flat-bottomed for rivers, others high-prowed for sea. They were made of cedar and pine, lashed with rope and patched by hand. Sails were used when the wind allowed, but oars were always at the ready. Crew members lived tough lives, exposed to the elements, soaked with spray, often sleeping beside cargo. But they kept Japan's economy flowing. And for passengers, the sea offered a unique kind of journey, not just motion, but silence, horizon, and reflection. In a land shaped by water, boats were more than transport. They were lifelines, carving paths across rivers, between islands, and through the fog of history. Inns, meals, and the traveler's experience. Travel in ancient Japan wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was about the journey itself, the sights, the fatigue, the meals, and the places you rested your head. Along every major route, especially the Tokaido, Nakasendo, and Koshu Kaido, stood dozens of shukuba, post towns built specifically for travelers. Each post town had a range of inns, from basic lodgings to luxurious accommodations reserved for the elite. These inns were called hatago, honjin, or waki honjin, depending on their status. The honjin was the top-tier inn, where daimyo, imperial envoys, or shogunate officials stayed. It offered private rooms, lavish meals, guards, and an entourage of attendants. Ordinary travelers weren't even allowed to enter. Most people stayed in hatago, affordable inns that offered shared rooms, rice, soup, and maybe a small cup of sake if you had the coin. Travelers were welcomed at the door by an innkeeper, given hot water to wash, and shown to a tatami-matted room. In colder months, you might warm your hands at a hibachi or sip hot tea by the hearth. Dinner was often humble but comforting: rice, pickles, miso soup, grilled fish if the region allowed. For wealthier travelers, the meals were more elaborate, and sometimes served with sake or local specialties like tofu, buckwheat noodles, or river eel. After a long day of walking, perhaps 6 to 8 rai, or 24 to 32 kilometers, that meal and floor mat felt like paradise. In the evenings, the post towns came alive. Travelers shared stories around lanterns. Poets composed verses about moonlight or aching legs. Sometimes, entertainers performed music, dance, or comedy. And yes, in larger towns, the pleasure quarters were part of the landscape too. Geisha, musicians, and performers brought warmth and color to the traveler's night. Before bed, travelers might visit a nearby temple or leave a coin at a roadside shrine for luck on tomorrow's journey. The next morning, roosters crowed. The road called, and travelers rose, strapped on their sandals, and continued the walk. Because in ancient Japan, the road was not just a means of movement. It was a theater of life, full of flavor, fatigue, laughter, and learning. Sacred movement. In ancient Japan, travel was more than a necessity. It was a discipline, a ritual, and often a spiritual act. The terrain was difficult, the rules were strict, but still, people moved, on foot, by ferry, on horseback, or in palanquins, across mountains, forests, and seas. They walked not just to arrive, but to transform. Pilgrims believed that every step burned away karma. Samurai rode not just for duty, but for honor. Couriers carried not only messages, but history in motion. And merchants, peasants, poets, all walked the same roads, leaving traces in the dust. In Shinto, movement through nature, across rivers, beneath torii gates, up stone stairs, mirrored the spiritual path to purity. In Buddhism, the act of walking became a metaphor for life itself, progress through impermanence, awareness with each breath, endurance over destination. Even the design of roads carried symbolism. Bridges marked thresholds. Stone markers served as guardians. Resting places weren't just physical, they were moments of presence. And though modern Japan has changed, echoes of this sacred movement remain. The pilgrimage routes still exist, from the Kumano-Kodo to the Shikoku 88 Temple Path. And in the hum of a train or the curve of a country road, you can still feel it, the quiet rhythm of a nation that once walked together. So as you step off today's bullet train or board a city bus, remember, these movements were once made barefoot, with intention, sweat, and song. Every road we now take for granted was once carved by foot, guided by the sun, the stars, and the will to reach somewhere, just over the next hill. To move in ancient Japan was not to rush. It was to travel through culture, through story, and through self. Thank you for watching Japan Rewind. If this journey moved you, please subscribe, like, and comment to share your thoughts or your favorite part of Japan's old ways. Let us know. If you lived back then, how would you have traveled? Until next time, keep walking forward, but always looking back.